All right. Welcome back to WeatherGod's Wisdom, where we talk about tropics and various other meteorological events. As you can see, I have a very busy Atlantic today. We've got tropical storm, soon to be Hurricane Humberto, who has improved quite a bit. We have our little not an invest here, that is in the Gulf of Mexico. We'll be looking at that first. And we have our monsoon trough that has a couple of areas of interest right here. One right here, just south of 10 North, and moving west at this point. And then we've got one that's just north of 10 North, a little more broad. So first we're going to kind of look at the overall view of the Atlantic and the vorticity. So you can see we have two areas of low level vorticity here in the Gulf of Mexico, and got two very similar areas along this monsoon trough, and you can see there's a stronger area of vorticity along the monsoon trough here on the respective ends of the monsoon trough. And if you look at the Eastern Atlantic, we're going to cover this first actually, because it'll not take as long. You can see right in here, I've got a general trough that's kind of looks like a little bend, and you can see that again if you go back to the Vort map. General kind of bendiness, and this end right here, which is forecast to develop by the National Hurricane Center, has kind of been swirling all day. This is an old visible loop, and you can see there's various areas. You got winds coming largely out of the southwest here and coming out of the northeast here. Just a long kind of gyre in here, and you can see some areas have more spin than others. And you can see there's kind of a spin right here, along this gyre, overall turning that, if you look at the European model, which does a decent job of initializing this, it's not a great job. It kind of gradually intensifies, and we're back to now having a small hurricane develop out of this, according to the European model. It's been flipping back and forth between, as you can see, it's not as strong here, more strong here, and further back. And this is because, and even has two systems here, this is because this is still 5 days out, and a lot can change, and track variability is seen here at the National Hurricane Center's 5-day outlook. You can see it has it all the way stretching from almost at the Antilles to well north of the Antilles, which are right here. Now we're going to look at our Gulf system. So if you look at water vapor loop, the Gulf of Mexico, you can see the upper level low has retrograded almost completely to the west, and we're going to look at the 200 millibar vorticity here. You can see it's more broad and less defined, and so there's a lot of just overall turning, and you can see this mid-level dry air right in here. That is, if you look at the true color loop, it is really shown up here. There's not a whole lot of cloud cover in here, but there's a little more over here, and that's how you can tell there's the two areas of vorticity in here. You've got one little area of spinning, which is actually pretty well defined, but there's very little convection, and that's due to shear from the upper level low. And then you have another area of turning right in here, which is a little less defined but has more convection, and it's all kind of to the north of this area of turning, which is not great. And you can also see an outflow boundary, which actually hampers the area, the turning here. So this is not a healthy system. This is kind of just a broad trough working its way around this upper level low, and this upper level low will pinwheel it into Texas. And you can see why the National Hurricane Center does not think this is going to develop. I don't think this is going to develop, and I really don't think that anyone should think this is going to develop. So Yeah, this will be primarily a rainmaker for the northern Gulf Coast, and you can see there's some rain starting to come ashore here, and eventually it'll work its way into Texas. But now let's look at Humberto. We're going to start with the 200 millibar vorticity. You can see that the area of southerly shear that was being impinged upon the system has significantly relaxed. You can still see it here, this little mark of 200 millibar vorticity that is now well south of the system. And if you look at the water vapor loop, you can see there's not a whole lot of shear that's happening in here. You've got a little bit of mid-level shear. You can see on these storms over Florida that is pushing into the system, which is kind of undercutting this overall developing outflow channel around the system. You can see it's really taken off on the western side, not as much as, of course, on the northeastern and southeastern quadrants, but overall, the storm structure has significantly improved. And if you look at microwave imagery, you can see it's starting to develop an eye in here. You've got very strong band of convection kind of working its way around this gyre of this very large area of circulation. It's starting to tighten up a little bit, and you can see if we update the recon that the storm's overall center is very broad still, and this is likely due to the fact that it is a larger storm at a higher latitude, and so it's going to take a little bit more time for the system to congeal. And you can see here on the visible loop, you've got these radial convective bands circulating around the center, and you can see they're kind of gradually tightening. And I assume this is going to continue throughout the night as this storm kind of drifts to the north and eventually turns to the east. It's not going to gain much more latitude the next couple of days. And again, if you look at the overall track forecast, this really does not gain much latitude until about 3 days out when it starts heading towards Bermuda. And I want to show you something that's interesting about this track forecast, and we're still very uncertain. This is the European ensembles through 120 hours. You can see some of these models, or some of these runs, have it turning back towards the eastern United States, and some even have it looping around here and never really getting going to the east. And this is very interesting because some even have it like hitting Florida, but most of it, it's a almost 1,000 mile spread in here all along the. If you superimpose this over the East Coast, it would be about from Nova Scotia down to Georgia. And this is very interesting to me that some models turn it back, or some ensembles turn it back. And if you look at the 500 millibar forecast height anomaly for Humberto, you can see why. This very elongated high that would push it back towards the United States if it were stronger, but kind of the consensus right now is that this trough will ultimately grab Humberto and take it out, but it gets stuck in here, and that's what's interesting. We don't know much around 5 days, and ultimately where this is in the 5-day period will determine whether or not this kind of turns back or it goes out to sea, because if you look a little longer, you can see that there's not a whole lot of stuff that really pushes this out. And so you kind of have a high right here that's a little stronger than this blocking high over Canada, because you can see 594 millibar heights versus the not really that strong heights that are in here that would push it back to the south and west. If you have Humberto a little further to the south, and this high is able to have a little bit more of a grip, then it could potentially push it back towards the west, and we could still be talking about the United States being in the path of the system. But for now, I think the NHC based on the NHC's forecast, this is not very likely. But it all depends on how fast Humberto moves in the next couple of days. But for now, we're looking at a pretty strong tropical storm. This could get as strong as a major hurricane. The National Hurricane Center has it quite close to that. And as the system eventually turns off to the east, it'll be entering a little cooler waters and will begin to weaken. But in the meantime, the National Hurricane Center has this as a hurricane up to day 4. But once it, of course, interacts with a trough, it should weaken a little bit and should head out to sea. And now, I mean, it ultimately depends on where this thing is, because if it's a little further south, as some of the European ensembles have it, then they turn it back towards the United States, and that's a problem. Because if it turns back to the United States, the mid-Atlantic is in play here, and even some models take it as far south as the Carolinas. So I would watch this warily. This is not entirely out of the question. This could get uncomfortably close to the United States. It ultimately depends on where it is at day 3. And if it's further west, then clearly we're dealing with something that could potentially turn back, because this 500 millibar ridge would have a little more influence. You have 591 millibar heights to the south of Humberto, which, if it is a little further south, would obviously be kind of over the system almost, and would push it to the south and west, which is not ideal. So keep an eye on this. That's really all I have to say here, other than just, all credit goes to Levi Cowan at Tropical Tidbits for the satellite and model data, and to the University of Wisconsin and weathernerds.com for this helpful ensemble forecast. And all I have to say is stay safe and have a good evening, and thanks for watching. Appreciate it.